1980s were interesting times. Everything from the music to politics and even the culture was in some respects different than many back in the 1970s would have expected. It was the same way in the automotive world. Everything in the 1980s had changed so quickly from what was the norm in the 1970s. Due to the corporate average fuel economy, CAFE standards, which first took effect by the late 1970s, cars shrunk at a feverish pace. After this, so many cars had to make do with smaller displacement engines. The V8, which was found under the hood of most cars in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, by the 1980s, due to the CAFE standards, was now performing a disappearing act. Only a few remaining large cars, some mid-size cars, and some performance cars were available with a V8 in the 1980s. There were good performing V8s available during the 1980s. However, they were generally much lower in displacement than previous V8s and therefore missing the massive torque of the large displacement V8s from the original muscle car era. Displacement may have been down and the engines may have been full of emissions controls. However, Detroit still managed to keep performance car fans satisfied most of the time with their performance offerings in the 1980s. V8-powered American performance cars were encountering very strong sales. In fact, so much so that it was in essence version 2.0 of the American muscle car era. It was a pleasant change from the downward performance spiral of the 1970s. Though there were many respectable performance V8 engine offerings during the 1980s, they were all beaten by a V6. Yes, you heard correctly. A V6 in the 1980s had all the high-performance V8s beat. During the 1980s, nothing could beat the performance of Buick's intercooler-equipped turbo 3.8-liter sequential fuel-injected SFI V6. Buick, which had built a solid reputation back during the original muscle car era with 400, 401, and 455 cubic inch V8s, by the late 1970s had decided to forge a different path. Where GM's other divisions that sold performance cars were shifting to lower displacement V8s in anticipation of the 1980s, Buick decided to scrap the V8 entirely and march ahead with a V6. Only problem was the Buick's V6 was a small displacement motor that had absolutely no tire scorching potential. Power output was a dismal 110 horsepower for 1975 from Buick's 231 cubic inch 3.8-liter V6. And looking at the Buick's V6 in comparison to even a small block V8, it was very puny. So small that it looked like it could easily be lifted from the engine bay with your bare hands. Buick had originally released its V6 in the early 1960s. After only a few production years, Buick was tired of the slow-selling V6 and sold it to Kaiser, which used it in its Jeep lineup. By the time the federal regulations were putting the squeeze on big motors and gas prices had skyrocketed in the early 1970s, Buick had realized that it had made a big mistake selling its V6. Fortunately, it was able to buy back its V6 from the American Motors Corporation, which by this time was Jeep's new owner, in enough time to make it available for the 1975 model year, which was not a moment too soon. Buick put the V6 to good use and it sold very well. As GM shrunk all its cars across its entire lineup, the 3.8-liter V6 became even more popular since other GM divisions would use it. When GM would later move to a mostly front-wheel drive car lineup, the small, light, and very reliable Buick-derived pushrod 3.8-liter V6 became GM's version of pure gold. By the 1990s, it was found in many of GM's front-wheel drive cars, and it was only retired about a decade ago, making it one of GM's most popular and longest production V6 engines ever. Back in 1975, nobody could have predicted the 3.8-liter V6's sales success, and the same was true with the domination of the turbo version of this motor in the 1980s. Buick had its eyes on the prize and did not let a little thing like missing two cylinders and a lack of displacement stand in the way of making the ultimate American performance motor of the 1980s. Buick started off in 1978 with two turbo versions of the 3.8-liter V6, one with a two-barrel carburetor and the other with a four-barrel carburetor. Output was 150 horsepower and 165 horsepower respectively. Before you balk at these figures, the non-turbo version of the 3.8-liter V6 for 1978 was rated at only 105 horsepower. So it's easy to see that Buick was onto something. Even Chevrolet, which at the time put most of its performance eggs in its small block V8's basket, saw the merit of having a performance-oriented V6. Chevrolet offered the Buick Turbo 3.8-liter V6 as an option in its 1980 to 1981 Monte Carlo. Sales of the Turbo Monte Carlo were good the first year. 13,839 were produced. And the Turbo 4-barrel V6's output of 170 horsepower was better than the V8-powered 1980 to 1981 Monte Carlo. However, sales slipped to just 3,027 units for 1981, which is why Chevrolet did not offer a Turbo Monte Carlo after the 1981 model year. Though the Turbo 3.8-liter V6 would be available in other Buick offerings, the LeSabre and Toronado during some model years, it would be forever associated with Buick's Regal and the Regal's top-of-the-line performance model, the Grand National. Ironically, the Grand National, which was also known as the GN, would debut as a low-production silver and charcoal gray two-tone sporty Regal model for 1982. The look of performance was there, but unfortunately for most of the 215 1982 Grand Nationals produced, it was nothing more than an appearance package since Buick's 125 horsepower 4.1-liter V6, a larger displacement version of Buick's 3.8-liter V6, was found under the hood. Only a handful of the first-year Grand Nationals left the factory with Buick's 175 horsepower turbo 3.8-liter 4-barrel V6. Most buyers back in 1982 who wanted the Turbo V6 went with the Regal T-Type instead. For 1983, the Grand National did not return, but the Regal T-Type did, with a little more punch. A 5-horsepower bump from the previous year gave 180 ponies to the Turbo 4-barrel V6. For 1983, this was some serious horsepower. As a comparison, the Chevrolet Camaro Z28 and Pontiac Trans Am started off the 1983 model year with their hottest motor being 175 horsepower, 5-liter Crossfire fuel-injected V8. By the end of the model year, their best performance engine would be the 190 horsepower L69 4-barrel 5-liter HO V8. The same L69 5-liter HO V8 was found in the 1983 Monte Carlo SS. However, it produced 175 horsepower that year. The 5-liter 307 cubic inch HO V8 powered Oldsmobile Hurst Olds had 180 horsepower. The 175 horsepower 5-liter 4-barrel HO equipped 1983 Mustang GT was also nipping at the Turbo Regal's heels. So you can see the Turbo V6 powered Regal was holding its own against the competition, which had a lot more engine displacement. As great as things had become for Buick's Turbo 3.8-liter V6 by the 1983 model year, the best was yet to come for this tiny engine.